Have you ever wondered what happens at that exact moment between life and death? That thin, almost invisible line where everything seems suspended. Time, pain, even fear. What if, at that moment, someone you love deeply and who has already passed away was there, waiting for you? That was exactly what happened to him. He felt himself leaving. His body slowed down. The sounds of the world became distant, almost unrecognizable. And then, in the midst of a soft light and a welcoming silence, he saw him, his brother, the one who had passed away years ago. The reunion was so real, so intense that for a few seconds everything made sense. The pain of loss gave way to a silent embrace that said more than 1,000 words. But it was at that exact moment, when everything finally seemed at peace, that something completely unexpected happened. The brother, with eyes full of love and a serene expression, did not smile as he imagined. Instead, he said something that changed everything. "You can't stay." What did this mean? Why would someone who had left and whom he loved so much refuse his company in such a calm and bright place? Was it a dream, a hallucination, or was it one of those spiritual signs that we cannot explain with logic, but that we feel with our hearts? The story you are about to learn about is not just about a near-death experience. It is about bonds that continue to live on, even when the body is no longer here. About spiritual encounters with loved ones who, in some way, still walk alongside us. And about messages that come from the invisible to remind us that we still have something to do here. Have you ever been through this? Have you ever felt like someone who has passed away was trying to tell you something? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now may surprise you, and maybe even change the way you see life and death. It all started on an ordinary night, but nothing that followed would be ordinary. It all started on an ordinary night. One of those nights that doesn't seem to promise anything extraordinary. He was driving home, his thoughts still stuck in his routine, in the next day's commitments, in that silent feeling of just surviving. The road was dark, and the radio was playing a song he couldn't even remember what it was. But in a matter of seconds, maybe less, everything changed. A headlight coming the wrong way, a poorly calculated curve, the sound of an impact, and then silence. Not the silence of the city or the absence of noise. It was another kind of silence, thick, deep, a void filled with presence, as if time had dissolved and he was floating between two worlds. He no longer felt pain, but neither did he feel his body. His mind, however, was lucid, incredibly lucid. And it was in that space, between the life he knew and something he did not yet understand, that the real journey began. This critical moment, which could have been seen as nothing more than an accident, turned out to be the gateway to an experience that would transform everything. Not only the way he viewed spirituality, but the way he viewed existence itself. It was as if life had paused, not to punish him, but to show him behind the scenes of what most of us spend our entire lives ignoring. As the paramedics' machines tried to revive his body, something much bigger was happening inside. He found himself outside himself, literally. He could look at his own body, at the distressed faces around him, and he felt a strange peace, as if none of this belonged to him anymore. But at the same time, something still connected him to this reality, an invisible thread, a silent call, and that's when he saw it. The brother, the one who had passed away years before. His presence was real as any living person. He didn't float, he didn't wear white clothes, nor did he appear surrounded by cinematic lights. It was him, with the same serene smile, the same meaningful gaze. The difference was the atmosphere. Everything around him vibrated with a kind of hidden truth, as if that space between worlds revealed a dimension that our ordinary eyes cannot capture. And in that instant, everything inside him screamed for answers. Why is he here? What does this mean? Am I dead? Is this a dream? But before he could ask any questions out loud, he heard them, not with his ears, but with his consciousness, as if the words were shared thoughts. His brother said, with tenderness and firmness at the same time, "Not yet. Your journey here is not over." That statement came as a revelation. because deep down, even without understanding all the details, he knew what it meant. It wasn't just a vision. It wasn't a delusion of a collapsing mind. It was a message, a call to return, to stay, to continue something that was still under construction. The most curious thing is that, even there, faced with one of the most impactful experiences of his life, he felt at peace, and at the same time, deeply challenged. Because accepting to return meant dealing with everything he had been avoiding. The emptiness, the unresolved pain, the decisions he had postponed, the dreams he had buried under routine. It was as if his brother was not only saying, "You can't stay," but also, "You still have things to do, things that only you can accomplish." Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because what comes next could reveal a lot about the signs we ignore every day and the invisible impact they have on our lives. The first thing he noticed was the weightlessness. There was no more pain, no more gravity. It was as if his body had been left behind, and all that was left was a floating but strangely alert consciousness. Time felt different here, slower, denser, almost as if each second held deeper meaning, like the pages of a book finally opening. There was a light, but not a blinding light, more like a welcoming dimness, coming not from any one point, but from the entire environment around him. It was like no other place on earth, and yet there was a strange familiarity in the air, as if he had been there before, or as if this other side had always existed within him. The atmosphere was silent, but not empty. It was a silence that spoke, that touched. He felt emotions he couldn't name, a mixture of gratitude, melancholy, reverence, and longing. And it was in this soft immensity that, suddenly, a presence stood out. At first, it seemed just a shadow among the shapes, but it didn't take long for the contours to reveal themselves. The way he walked, the way he crossed his arms, the look in his eyes. It was him, his brother. He was there, alive, or rather, present, without the marks of the illness that took him, without the tiredness of his wasting body. It was like seeing him in his best version, whole, serene. An energy of love and wisdom enveloped everything around him. And in that moment, all certainties crumbled, because until then he didn't know if he was dead. But seeing his brother there, with such clarity, gave him a strange feeling of absolute truth, a hidden truth that logic could never explain. They didn't hug right away. There was no rush. It was as if they both knew that this moment was too sacred to be rushed. They just looked at each other for a long time. And in that look, there was surrender. There were unspoken questions, silent answers, and a connection that words could never convey. It was then that he realized that there, in that place between worlds, there was no need for language. Everything was transmitted by presence, by intention. The brother approached. His face was both strong and affectionate. He didn't look like someone who had come to say goodbye. He looked like someone with a mission. And although he expected an explanation, perhaps comfort, what he received was something much deeper. The brother simply said, "You are not ready. There are still things you need to live through." In that moment, the impact of those words reverberated like a wave. It wasn't a rejection. It was a call, a reminder that the journey wasn't over yet. And as tempting as it was to remain in that place of peace, there was a part of him that understood, that knew, and that, even without wanting to, accepted, because there was something here, in this world, that still depended on him. Perhaps the most surprising thing was what he felt at that moment, a mixture of gratitude and responsibility. Gratitude for having had that encounter, and responsibility for what still needed to be done. He understood that the encounter with his brother was not just a gift to ease his longing, but an opportunity for transformation. A chance to change course, to see behind the scenes of his own life, to change his mindset and make more conscious decisions. Seeing my brother there, smiling so fully, was like looking at the reflection of a forgotten truth. We are not just bodies. We are memories, purposes, essence. And even after death, something inside us continues. Witnessing that was like stepping through a curtain and catching a glimpse of what lies behind it. A revelation without words, a kind of knowledge that cannot be taught in books, but that changes everything from the inside. He didn't remember taking a step, but suddenly they were side by side, and his brother was guiding him, not along a common path, but through a space where everything seemed symbolic, the ground that wasn't ground, the lights that came from nowhere, the shapes that changed according to his feelings. It was like walking inside himself, but guided by someone who had already gone beyond. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what this brother showed him in the following moments goes far beyond a reunion. It was a true awakening, with revelations that challenge everything we believe about life, death, and purpose. That silent walk between dimensions seemed to follow no physical logic. There was no direction, no fixed destination. It was as if everything was being built around them as the connection between them intensified. And then, in a moment almost outside of time, something happened that he never forgot. His brother stopped. He turned slowly. He looked into his eyes with an intensity that went through everything. The body he no longer had, the pain that had already ceased, even the years that separated them. And without saying a word, he hugged him. But it wasn't an ordinary hug. It was the kind of hug that brings back everything that was lost, that silences old guilt, that undoes unresolved silences, that rescues love in its purest form. It wasn't just the reunion of two brothers. It was the reunion of souls that still had something to say to each other, something that time, distance, and even death couldn't erase. In that embrace, he felt a wave of warmth that did not come from the touch, but from within, as if his own spirit were being remade. It was acceptance, it was forgiveness, it was belonging, and above all, it was a confirmation that true love, the kind that is born from deep connection, does not die. It only changes form. It transforms into presence, into living memory, into an impulse of healing. At that moment, tears began to appear, but they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of release, of an old pain that he didn't even know he still carried, the guilt of not being so close in the last few months, the doubt about whether his brother had left in peace, the fear that I would never be able to say everything that had been stuck in my chest. And now, all of that was there, dissolved, undone, healed. The brother whispered, not with words, but with vibrations that echoed in the heart, "You are loved, you are forgiven, and that is okay." And that was enough to break years of inner silence, because there are pains that time does not heal, but that a single gesture of the soul can completely transform. And he understood there in that dimension between worlds, that hug was not just his. It was also for everyone who carries absences, for everyone who keeps words that were never said, for everyone who, in some way, was trapped between what was lived and what there was no time to live. It was as if that moment condensed the entire emotional journey they had been through together, from childhood to their final goodbye. The fights, the laughter, the lessons learned, the distances and the reunions, everything was there. Every memory, every silence, every gesture. And now, everything had new meaning. There was no more guilt, no more resentment, just love. A love that doesn't require an explanation, that doesn't depend on physical presence, that simply is, intense, real, absolute. After that hug, he was no longer the same, and deep down, he knew it. Even without knowing whether he would return to his body or remain there, something inside him had reorganized itself. It was as if that gesture had unlocked forgotten memories, and at the same time, awakened truths that he had always carried but never had the courage to face. Truths about who he was, about what really mattered, about the kind of legacy he wanted to leave. A new mindset was being born there, not one shaped by routine or fear of making mistakes, but a deeper awareness, a rare clarity about what it really means to be alive. Because sometimes, it's only on the edge between life and death that we understand the true impact of our decisions, what we failed to do, what we chose to ignore, and what needs to be healed before it's too late. That reunion was not just a spiritual gift. It was a key, a kind of emotional password that opened inner doors, that illuminated dark corners of the soul. And that showed that forgiveness, when it comes from the other side, is not just a relief. It is a bridge, a passage, an invitation to the deepest transformation that anyone can experience. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what came after this hug was something even more revealing, and perhaps the most decisive moment of this entire journey between two worlds. The energy of that hug was still pulsing in his chest when his brother, with a more serious expression now, took a step back. There was no distance in the gesture, but rather intention, as if preparing to say something that carries weight, truth, and urgency. The space around him seemed to become even more silent, as if even time had stopped to listen. And then he heard, clearly, not with his ears, but in a way that pierces his soul. "You can't stay here yet. Your mission isn't over." These words came not as an imposition, but as a revelation, as if the veil between what he thought he knew and what he was about to discover had been torn. His brother's presence was no longer just comfort, but guidance. This was no ordinary farewell. It was a turning point. The sentence seemed simple, but it carried layers that his spirit was still beginning to understand. Because the issue was not just that he needed to go back, the issue was because needed. The moment he heard that, something inside him shifted, as if an invisible puzzle began to fit together. He thought of the times he had ignored signs, the opportunities he had postponed, the connections he had missed out of pride or distraction. He thought of the decisions he had made more out of fear than truth. It was as if every unconscious choice had brought him here. And now, faced with his departed brother, he was being asked to change course, to rethink everything. But what exactly did I come to do? He asked himself. And his brother, as if he had heard, answered without moving his lips. "You know?" It wasn't an objective answer, but it echoed with a disconcerting certainty. Because deep down he knew. He always knew, but he had forgotten. Or rather, he had gotten used to not remembering. It was at that moment that he understood that the mission was not about something grand in the eyes of the world. It was not about success, fame, or external accomplishments. It was about presence, about being whole where he was fragmented, about touching lives with authenticity, about loving deeper, forgiving faster, listening with more intention, about not wasting time on what doesn't matter and not running away from what matters most. The brother then pointed to a mirror of sorts, but it wasn't made of glass. It was like a vibrant window, showing scenes from his life, moments he recognized, but that now seemed different. A look he'd looked away from, a phone call he hadn't returned, a gesture he hadn't had the courage to make. The underlying truth of it all was simple and profound. He was still halfway there. There was still impact to be made, people to be reached, wounds that only he could help heal, including within himself. It was then that he felt something new, a sense of sacred responsibility. Not that heavy guilt that paralyzes us, but a consciousness that liberates. Like someone who wakes up and understands that life is more than just surviving. It is a journey full of meaning, and he still had important chapters to write. His brother was still there, but now with a look that mixed tenderness and firmness. There was no longer any doubt. It was time to go back. But the return, he soon realized, would not be just a return to his body. It would be a return with a new mindset, with a kind of vision he had not had before. He knew that when he opened his eyes again, everything that was ordinary would seem different, because he would be different, and perhaps no one around him would understand what he had experienced, but he would know, and that was enough. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what happened in the next instant, the very moment he agreed to return, brought revelations that go beyond anything that can be explained with words. To say that this place was peaceful would be an understatement. It was more than tranquility. It was as if he was immersed in a vibration of completeness, where there was no fear, rush, demands, or absences, no physical pain, no emotional anguish. Everything was suspended in a state of plenitude that you can only understand when you feel it. It was like returning home after a long time away, but a home I had never visited before. And yet, I knew every detail. His soul recognized that place, as if it had always been part of his essence. And that is precisely why the decision was not easy. Because when one is enveloped by this kind of serenity, everything earthly seems small. Worries lose strength, emotional wounds lose color, life's dilemmas dissolve like smoke. He felt that there, in that space between worlds, there was nothing left to seek. Everything was. Everything was enough. So why go back? That was the question that echoed within him. And with it came conflict. Not a conflict made of pain and resistance, but of deep understanding. Because no matter how comfortable that place was, no matter how strong the desire to stay, something inside him whispered that it was not time yet, that there was something waiting for him, something unfinished, an unfulfilled purpose, a journey that still needed to be lived in its entirety. His brother, with his silent presence and firm gaze, did not try to convince him. He did not force anything. He simply looked at him with the wisdom of someone who has already understood that each soul has its time, but also its calling. And in that silence full of meaning, he began to remember, not facts, but feelings. That look he promised never to abandon, of the son who still needed a hug, of the words that had not yet been said to the person he loved, of the choices he had not yet had the courage to make, and, most importantly, of a version of himself that had not yet awakened. The peace I felt there was perfect, but the call to return was full of meaning, a kind of force that did not shout, but did not remain silent either. It was as if the universe was saying, you still have an impact to make. You still have truths to discover. There are still people who will be touched by who you are. And in that moment, he understood that the mission was not just a duty. It was a privilege. The dilemma was not between heaven and the pain of life. It was between the completeness of leaving and the transformative potential of staying. Because, deep down, he knew that returning meant starting over with different eyes, re-seeing people, decisions, and paths with a more awakened conscience. And he realized something powerful. True peace is not just in where we are, but in how we are, in how we decide to live. There were no guarantees. He didn't know how much time he had or what he would face, but there was a silent certainty that something inside him had changed, that life would never be the same again, because now he knew a hidden truth. He knew that there was more beyond matter, that connections don't break with death, and that love, when it's real, doesn't disappear. It just changes form and continues to manifest itself behind the scenes of existence. His brother looked at him once again with tenderness, without words, as if blessing a decision, as if understanding the pain of returning, but also the greatness of it. And that was when he felt it, a strange lightness, a strength rising from the center of his chest, the sensation that something was being put back in place, a complete acceptance, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary, because life, even with its challenges, still awaited him with opportunities that only he could experience. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the moment he crossed the line back between two worlds was marked by a revelation that carries a rare teaching, and that many people only understand when it is too late. It was like crossing an invisible membrane, something you couldn't see but could feel breaking. The moment he agreed to come back, there were no flashing lights, no loud sounds, but rather an almost imperceptible transition, soft, silent, but profoundly powerful, as if his soul was returning along a thread of energy that connected it to his body, and as it reconnected, something inside him ignited. A memory, a purpose, a new way of being in the world. The air seemed thicker when his eyes opened. The hospital lights were harsh, artificial. The smell of the room was familiar, but strange at the same time. There were sounds, voices, machines, the clanking of metal, but everything seemed to come from far away, as if he were still between two worlds. And maybe he was, because his body was there, but his spirit was still trying to reorganize itself, trying to process what he had just experienced. His rational mind struggled to understand, but his heart already knew. He had come back different. The first glance was at the ceiling, but the first real movement was internal, an almost indescribable sensation, that of being reborn, and not in a figurative sense. It was literal. It was as if I had woken up with a new lens in the eyes of my soul. Every detail around him, the sheet, the IV, the monitors, seemed to carry a meaning that he had not been able to see before, as if each little thing was part of a living, interconnected system, full of messages that we normally pass on without realizing it. He blinked slowly, trying to test the limits of his body. He was weak, yes, but weakness didn't scare him, because what was driving him now came from somewhere else. It was deeper. It was the silent conviction that his life was no longer just about living. It was about living with intention, and that changed everything. The first words he tried to form came out low, hoarse, almost soundless, but he didn't need to say anything at that moment. Just being there said a lot. The nurses noticed him, their eyes filled with surprise. One of them pressed the call button and ran to notify the doctors. He watched everything in silence, like someone watching a scene for the first time, even though he was in it. And it was in that attentive silence that he began to remember what he had felt there. Not the exact details, because what he had experienced could not be described in human language, but the profound truths that encounter had left imprinted on him. His brother's presence, the message he had received, the mission that still awaited him. All of this was now like a constant whisper within him, guiding every thought. And then something unexpected happened. When he was finally alone in the room for a few seconds, a light breeze passed through the closed window. There was no wind outside. There was no airflow, but he felt it. It was as if something or someone had left a final confirmation, a gentle touch from eternity, just so he wouldn't forget, as if to say, "You didn't imagine, you lived." And that brought him to tears, but not tears of pain. They were tears of someone who came back with more questions than answers, but with the certainty that he was now willing to listen, listening to life, to signs, to encounters, to hear what his soul had always known, but the noise of the world drowned out. It was the beginning of a new cycle, and this time he wanted to live differently. Little by little, the visits began. Family members were moved, doctors were surprised, and there were looks of disbelief. But he observed them calmly, as if he were seeing everything with different eyes, because it wasn't just his body that had been saved. It was his essence that had been awakened, and that doesn't fade with time. It doesn't fade with routine. It's something that transforms the way of life. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the way he lived after that reveals something essential about how each of us can choose to transform pain into purpose and presence into mission. The days that followed around him were unlike anything he had ever experienced, not because the world around him had changed. The streets were still the same, people were still rushing about, distracted, caught up in their own commitments, but because he had changed. It was as if the lens through which he saw everything had been adjusted. Colors were brighter, sounds were clearer, silences were deeper. Things that had previously gone unnoticed now seemed to contain hidden messages. Even the simplest moments, like hearing the wind through the trees or feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin, held a different presence. He was more present, and that presence wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, it was conscious. For a long time, he lived on autopilot, as so many do. I would wake up, work, resolve what I had to resolve, and try to sleep with my mind full. Priorities were always organized by urgency, not by meaning. But after what he had experienced, after moving on to another plan and returning with that hug still pulsing in my memory, everything needed to be reorganized. Not out of obligation, but out of coherence. It was no longer possible to live the way I had before. He began to choose more carefully, the way he spent his time, the people he connected with, the words he said, and most importantly, the ones he didn't say. He realized that time is not the greatest treasure, but rather how we fill that time. Because it's not about how much time you have, but how much time you have. You is present in every moment, and that was liberating. Some people found it strange. They said he seemed quieter, more introspective, but he wasn't distant. He was more inside himself, more connected to what he felt, more attentive to what really made sense. He began to seek fewer external answers and listen more to internal signals, Not those noises of the anxious mind, but the whispers of the soul, those that we usually silence out of fear, doubt, or convenience. His relationship with spirituality also changed. Before, it was something more theoretical, almost formal. Now, it was alive. It breathed with him. It didn't need schedules or complex rituals. It was in the small choices, in the spontaneous gestures, in the moments of silence, when he felt he wasn't alone. His brother's presence was subtle but constant, sometimes in a dream, sometimes in a thought that came out of nowhere. A silent piece of advice, a memory that calmed, a feeling that somehow he was still walking alongside. The experience made him understand that life is not about accumulating things, but about integrating meanings. That success is not about applause, but about coherence. That spirituality is not a theory, but a daily practice of presence and compassion. And that true transformation does not begin outside. It begins within, when the soul awakens and realizes that it is here for a greater reason than simply existing. He didn't become a saint. He continued to make mistakes, get angry, feel fear. But now there was a space inside him that observed all of this with more lightness. A space where the memory of that encounter lived, of that hug, of that voice that said, "Your mission is not over yet." And that was enough to remind me every day that even in the most difficult moments there was something greater guiding our steps, something that transcends logic, that escapes explanation, but that reveals itself in the silent impact of conscious choices. Reuniting with his brother helped him reconnect with himself, and that changed everything. It changed the way he looked at others. He began to listen more attentively, to judge less, to care more about what he left in people's hearts than what he received from them. He knew he couldn't change the whole world, but he could change the way he walked through it. And that, in itself, was already the beginning of a new reality. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because one day, in the midst of this new routine, he received a sign that he could not ignore, an unexpected confirmation that his brother was still close by, guiding, protecting, and, once again, teaching. His life had picked up again, at least on the outside. His commitments and responsibilities were back, but on the inside, there was a new kind of silence. Not the empty kind of silence, but the kind that seemed to hold an invisible presence. It was as if, even in the most banal moments, there was something else there, a subtle companion, a sharper intuition, a constant care coming from somewhere he couldn't pinpoint, and yet he could feel it. No matter how hard I tried to put it into words, there was a part of the experience that refused to be translated. It was as if language itself couldn't capture the depth of what I had experienced. The reunion, the message, the return, it had all become so intimately part of him that trying to explain it seemed to impoverish him. So he began to simply live, more truthfully, more presently, more listening, until something happened. It was a normal afternoon, the kind of day you don't expect anything. He was organizing some old boxes in the guest room, family things that had accumulated over the years, papers, photos, forgotten objects. That's when he found a notebook. The cover was worn, with signs of age, but when he opened it, he realized it was an old diary of his brother's, one he didn't even remember keeping. The writing was familiar, firm, but full of restrained emotion. The pages were short, sometimes just loose sentences, but each one seemed to have been written exactly for that moment in his life. On one of the pages near the end, a highlighted sentence caught his attention. It was written in a bold handwriting, as if his brother knew that one day it would need to be read. Life is too short to put off love for later. It fell like a silent thunderclap, not because of the sentence itself, but because of the certainty that came with it. He felt it, in his skin, in his heart, in the entire room. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was a sign. And it was there that something was confirmed. Not only by the sentence, but by the energy that surrounded it. A light scent in the air, the same perfume that her brother wore. A sudden shiver, even without any wind. A memory that appeared out of nowhere. Their last conversation, interrupted by a farewell that seemed definitive. Now, somehow, it was complete. Emotion took over. He sat there with the notebook on his lap and cried, not from sadness, but from understanding. It was as if all the pieces of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. The reunion had not been an illusion. The message had not been a delusion. It had all been real. And now, that physical object served as a material echo of a spiritual connection that had never been lost. After that, other signs came. Discreet, but unmistakable. A specific song playing on the radio at exactly the moment he thought of his brother. A dream so vivid that it seemed more like a visit than a memory. A child saying something unlikely that referred to an inside joke of theirs. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about recognizing the traces of a presence that no longer needed a body to make itself felt. These signs did not erase the longing, but they transformed mourning into dialogue. A silent but ongoing dialogue. Instead of carrying the weight of absence, he began to honor the presence. Instead of questioning why he had to return, he began to be grateful for having been chosen to continue. Because he finally understood that the most profound missions in life do not come wrapped in great achievements. They are revealed in the details, in the invisible decisions, in the courage to continue even without all the answers. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what he started to do with all of this reveals a kind of silent transformation, one that happens inside, but completely changes what we give to the world. What if it were you? If in the midst of a deep silence between vigil and what seems to be the end, someone you love, someone who has already left, appeared before you with the same look, the same way of standing, with that unmistakable presence, what would you do? What would you say? Would you be able to speak? Or would you just let your heart answer everything that was kept inside? This question began to accompany him every day, like a seed planted in the center of his consciousness. Not in a heavy way, but as a constant reminder that life is fragile, yes, but also extraordinarily full of opportunities. And the most curious thing is that, even without looking for it, he began to meet people who had gone through similar experiences. People who, for seconds or minutes, were also caught between two worlds. People who received signs, messages, or just that strong intuition that someone dear to them was still close by. It was as if, after all this, he had become a kind of bridge, not in the mystical sense, but as a listening point. Someone capable of welcoming these stories without judgment, because now he knew that the invisible also has a voice. And this caused something to change in the way he related to time, to haste and silence. He began to look people in the eye more, to listen more calmly, to embrace with more presence, because he understood that we never know if that moment will be the last. Not because of drama, but because of truth. And when you live with this awareness, even small actions take on a new weight, a new shine. The memory of his brother stopped being a full stop and became a comma, a continuous link with everything that still pulses between them. Sometimes he still feels like talking to him, and he does. In thought, in prayer, in silence. And these conversations are not sad. They are comforting, because he understood that what is true never disappears. It only changes shape, crosses dimensions, and continues to manifest itself in the details of everyday life, in a piece of advice that arrives at the right time, in a book that falls into his lap, in a choice that finally makes sense, in a gesture from someone who has never heard his story but who seems to have touched exactly where he needed it. What if you had that chance, to be for a moment in front of the one who left? What would you choose to say? Would you ask for forgiveness? Would you give one last hug? Or would you simply say, "I miss you, but I get it, and I'll keep going"? This question is not just hypothetical, because even if the reunion does not happen the way we imagine, the signs, when we allow them, continue to arrive, and they speak, sometimes in dreams, other times in memories that appear out of nowhere, in words that someone says without knowing why, or even in simple objects, like that forgotten notebook which carries a phrase with the power of revelation. None of this is about living stuck in the past. Quite the opposite. It's about moving forward with more awareness, with a new mindset, knowing that true bonds don't end with physical absence. They become purpose, a subtle presence, an impulse to live with more courage and depth. He understood that his mission was not about great deeds in the eyes of the world, but about living each moment with truth, loving with more intention, forgiving faster, saying what he feels before it's too late, and walking knowing that, no matter how invisible it may be, there is something or someone that still guides you from above, from within, from where words cannot reach. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there is something he learned deep down in his soul that can completely change the way you deal with your own losses, and most importantly, with your own life. If you've come this far, perhaps some part of this story has touched something deep inside you. Maybe you also carry an absence that still pulsates, or you've already felt, in some way, the presence of someone who left, but never stopped being with you. This channel exists for exactly that, to open up space for conversations that we often don't know where to have, but feel we need. So if this content made sense to you, if it sparked some reflection or just brought you a bit of peace in the midst of chaos, subscribe here. It will be good to have you close by on this journey. And tell me in the comments, what would you take away from this reunion? Or who do you think would be waiting for you on the other side? I like reading every story that appears here. Oh, and if this video connected with you in any way, leave a like. This helps us understand that it makes sense to continue bringing this type of content calmly with truth. And if you want to continue in this atmosphere with more stories that talk about signs, presence, and transformation, the next video is already waiting for you. It may bring exactly what you didn't even know you needed to hear.